Picture this: Berlin, May 1945. The once proud capital of the Third Reich lies in ruins, the thunder of Soviet artillery silenced only by the echo of surrender. The fall of Berlin not only marked the final chapter of Adolf Hitler's ambitions, but also sealed the fate of the Wehrmacht, the military machine that had ravaged Europe. As the Nazi regime collapsed, the world turned its gaze toward its architects and enforcers. What happened to the officers of the Wehrmacht after the war? These men, draped in iron crosses and battlefield honors, were suddenly fugitives of history, caught between retribution and reinvention. Some marched into captivity, others vanished into obscurity, or emerged as Cold War assets. Their fates were as varied as the front lines they once commanded, and their legacies became entangled in one of the most complex moral reckonings of the 20th century. In the final throes of the Second World War, the once mighty Wehrmacht crumbled beneath the pressure of a two-front assault. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was a hollow shell, its fuel depots dry, its cities reduced to ash, its ranks swollen with teenage conscripts and shattered divisions. The Battle of Berlin, waged from April 16th to May 2nd, was the Wehrmacht's last stand. Surrounded by Soviet forces and abandoned by Hitler's suicide, the German high command began to fracture. Officers faced a grim choice: die in place, surrender to the enemy, or flee westward in hopes of more merciful captors. In those chaotic final weeks, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht officers and soldiers surrendered, some to the Americans or British, but many into the hands of the Soviets, who viewed them not as soldiers, but as war criminals. The Allied powers, meanwhile, grappled with how to address the defeated army. Was every officer complicit in Nazi atrocities, or had the Wehrmacht merely served as a professional military, distinct from the SS? This dilemma would shape post-war justice. As Allied tribunals prepared for Nuremberg and new denazification laws took root, the western and eastern zones of occupation began divergent processes of reckoning. Wehrmacht officers, from field marshals to staff lieutenants, suddenly found themselves stripped of rank, imprisoned, interrogated, or in some cases, courted by new regimes eager to harness their military expertise. The end of the war marked the beginning of a long, uncertain trial for both the officers and the world judging them. As the smoke of surrender settled, Wehrmacht officers who had escaped the Soviet grasp found themselves in the custody of the Western Allies, principally the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Unlike the brutal gulags awaiting those captured in the East, the fates of officers in the West varied wildly, shaped by a cocktail of pragmatism, justice, and the looming shadow of the Cold War. At first, many Wehrmacht officers were swept into the vast machinery of Allied justice and denazification. In occupied Germany, the Western Allies established tribunals and internment camps where captured officers were subjected to exhaustive interrogations, loyalty screenings, and background checks. The central question was not merely who had given the orders, but who had allowed atrocities to happen, who had looked away, and who had served as a cog in the Nazi war machine. The most visible and symbolic of these reckonings came in the form of the Nuremberg trials, held from late 1945 through 1946. Among the defendants stood Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, whose signature adorned some of the war's most chilling directives, including the infamous Commissar Order, which sanctioned the execution of captured Soviet political officers. Keitel maintained that he was simply following orders from Hitler, that his oath demanded loyalty above conscience. But the tribunal rejected that defense outright, declaring that blind obedience was no shield against responsibility. Keitel was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and hanged on October 16, 1946. Beside him stood General Alfred Jodl, another key figure in operational planning, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer tried at Nuremberg. Though Kaltenbrunner represented the SS rather than the Wehrmacht, the juxtaposition underscored a wider reality. The lines between military command and ideological enforcement had blurred fatally during the war. These early trials laid a foundation for international law. establishing that military leaders could not claim neutrality behind uniforms or protocols. The Allies were not merely punishing the past, they were issuing a warning to the future. Yet even as the gallows were built for the highest-ranking offenders, a more complicated question simmered beneath the surface. Where did complicity end and simple service begin? For Wehrmacht officers captured by the Red Army, the post-war world was a bleak and punishing expanse. Unlike the Western zones, where trials and tribunals operated with a measure of transparency, the Soviet Union wielded vengeance with little concern for nuance. To Stalin's regime, the German officer class was not merely the face of fascist aggression. It was an existential enemy, a force to be broken, humiliated, and rendered harmless. After the fall of Berlin, entire columns of German soldiers, among them thousands of officers, were marched eastward, often on foot, to prison camps scattered across Siberia and Central Asia. These were not the orderly POW facilities of Geneva Conventions. The Soviets deemed most officers war criminals by default, denying them POW protections and subjecting them to forced labor, starvation, and torture. Interrogations were brutal, often designed to extract confessions, not for legal proceedings, but for propaganda or future leverage. The fate of General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, symbolized the Soviet approach. After his surrender in 1943, Paulus was turned into a tool of anti-Nazi propaganda, appearing on radio broadcasts and denouncing Hitler. Others were not so fortunate. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, also captured at Stalingrad, cooperated with the Soviets but never regained a normal life, dying in obscurity. In Eastern Europe, Wehrmacht officers fared no better. In Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, many were tried for atrocities committed during occupation. The trials were swift, often lacking due process. Executions were common. Günther Tribucite, commander of the 118th Jaeger Division, was tried in Belgrade and hanged in 1947, charged with massacres of civilians and reprisals against partisans. The Soviets did not begin releasing the last of their German captives until the mid-1950s, more than a decade after the war's end. For many families in Germany, the fate of missing fathers and brothers remained a mystery for years. In the East, justice blurred with vengeance, and few Wehrmacht officers returned home unscarred, if they returned at all. As the dust of war settled and Cold War lines were drawn, a powerful and problematic myth began to take shape in West Germany and among Western historians: the notion of the clean Wehrmacht. This idea held that the German army, unlike the SS or Gestapo, had waged an honorable, professional war and was largely uninvolved in Nazi crimes. It was a narrative that exonerated thousands of officers from deeper scrutiny and helped pave their reintegration into post-war society. Many former Wehrmacht generals fueled this myth themselves. Men like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian penned memoirs that emphasized tactical brilliance while downplaying or outright denying involvement in war crimes. They painted themselves as apolitical soldiers, bound by duty and unaware of the atrocities committed by the regime they served. These narratives found a receptive audience, not only among Germans eager to rebuild national pride, but among Western powers increasingly fixated on the Soviet threat. This moral sanitization had real consequences. In the 1950s, when West Germany rearmed under NATO's blessing, former Wehrmacht officers were invited to shape the new Bundeswehr. The founding leadership of West Germany's army included dozens of ex-Wehrmacht generals, many of whom had once served on the Eastern Front. Few were prosecuted further, and denazification programs quietly waned in intensity. But cracks in the myth began to appear. Historians uncovered damning evidence. Wehrmacht units involved in the shooting of civilians, scorched earth campaigns, the starvation of Soviet POWs, and logistical support for the Holocaust. The argument that the Wehrmacht had remained clean no longer held. Still, the legacy remained complex. The Wehrmacht was not a monolith. Some officers resisted Nazi orders, others served with cold efficiency, and many operated in the gray zones in between. Yet for decades, the myth allowed a generation to rewrite its legacy. It shielded culpability, reshaped public memory, and delayed Germany's full reckoning with its past. It wasn't until the 1990s, with exhibitions like The Crimes of the Wehrmacht, that the facade truly began to crumble. When Berlin fell, so too did the command posts, field maps, and war rooms of the Wehrmacht officer corps. But their stories did not end in the rubble. Some were executed for their roles in a regime that waged genocidal war. Others vanished into Soviet labor camps, never to be heard from again. Still more found new purpose in post-war Germany, helping to build armies, write histories, or fuel extremist movements. The world's response to these men was fractured, part justice, part pragmatism, part willful forgetting. In the East, vengeance ruled. In the West, utility often triumphed over accountability. And in Germany itself, the question of guilt was buried beneath layers of narrative, politics, and reconstruction. Today, as we confront new wars and reckon with past ones, the fate of these officers forces us to ask, when does duty end and moral responsibility begin? And can a soldier ever truly separate the two?